Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is a lecture on goods and virtues in the context of modernity. Specifically, I'm talking about the concepts of practices, narrative unity of life, and tradition in MacIntyre's After Virtue. What I want to do is begin by situating MacIntyre's work within the context of modernity, and particularly within his idea of the benefit of the questions that Nietzsche asked. So in The Gay Science, Nietzsche writes, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we forget ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it?" What Nietzsche is talking about here is the idea that with modern science and modern philosophy, we no longer rely on God to answer many of the questions that we asked before. And within the context of morality, we can say that Nietzsche is arguing that our moral beliefs have to change because they can no longer be the beliefs we received from a religious authority, because we've killed God. God doesn't exist for us anymore as a justifier of the moral ought. And for MacIntyre, this is because Nietzsche recognizes that morality no longer has a basis in modernity. And so it ties into MacIntyre's larger critique of modernity in the fact that we have broken off the relationship between what I am now and what I ought to be. And this relationship between these two questions, what am I now and what ought I to be, is a context which gives moral words their meaning. Now here he's following Anscombe and saying that the words that we use today in morality, whether we're talking about rights and duties or virtues, utility, whatever it might be that we're talking about, they no longer have the context in which they make sense. And Nietzsche was recognizing this in his claim that we have killed God because it was God who helped give the context of many of the moral theories that we had before. And so one of the questions that he forces us to ask, that is, that Nietzsche forces us to ask, is why are the moral principles that we so defend today the same ones that we defended before we got rid of God, before we got rid of the telos in the universe? And if you're interested in that concept, you might go back and look at one of my lectures on telos and MacIntyre's critique of modernity. Just to kind of give us an idea of what we're talking about here, think about whether a future in which we've lost all sports and what we have left are a basketball, a bat, and some ice skates. These don't make sense together, and yet we try to play a game as if they work together, as if they are the things that we should be playing the game with. That's the same thing that's going on with morality today, according to MacIntyre. We have all of these different concepts that don't fit together, and we keep trying to live a moral life as though they do fit together. So MacIntyre says, look, we have to make a choice between Nietzsche or Aristotle. Nietzsche says that we've abandoned God, but we've also abandoned our idea of some kind of telos, our meaning in the universe. Whereas Aristotle, of course, said that there is a telos to human life, and it's flourishing. It's the flourishing that we can find by being human beings. Now, of course, Aristotle said that this flourishing related to the, the function of human life, which for him was reasoning, and so he was able to discard great numbers of people from moral flourishing. And we can talk about women and slaves and workers in general. Well, MacIntyre is going to reject this, and so what he wants to do is try to find some way to take Aristotle's idea of a telos and bring it back into modernity so that we undermine the sort of critique that we get from Nietzsche. In order to do this, he wants to think about goods and virtues on three levels: the level of practices, the level of narrative unity of life, and the level of tradition. I want to go through each of these relatively briefly, but hopefully in a way that kind of shows us the way that MacIntyre answers the problems of modernity. So I'm not giving you MacIntyre's official definition of practices. If you're interested in that and you want to know more about practices, then I encourage you to watch the lecture on practices that I've made and put on YouTube. For our purposes, a practices involves five aspects. And so we might think about something like cooking here. Cooking is a human activity. There's lots of different things that are involved. There's chopping and dicing. There's heating things up. There's mixing things together. All kinds of different things that go into this one activity. And yet all together they're a coherent activity, right? We know why someone is cutting up the tomato or dicing up the garlic. And the practice of cooking is also a cooperative practice. We learn from others how to cook, but we also might have different people that we're cooking with. The chief chef, the sous chef, all these different kinds of people that might be in the kitchen with us. So it can be a complex activity. Obviously, cooking a hamburger at home is one of the least complex things that we can do, but making a French 7-course meal might be a very complex thing. And it's socially established. People know what we're doing when we're chopping up garlic and putting some diced tomatoes with it. There are goods that are internal to the practice, and I want to focus on those in just a minute, so I'm going to hold off on that for a second. There are standards of excellence that are appropriate to the practice and definitive of it. So one standard of excellence would be maybe not killing the people that you're feeding, but might even have a more lofty standard of excellence, which is making people swoon at the taste of the food that you put together. Human powers are extended. Now here I like to think about the creativity. Creativity is a particular human power. I don't think we share creativity with any other non-human animals. And here we might include within human beings Neanderthal and some other pre-Homo sapien species. But creativity is very important in cooking. You've got to put different things together to make a meal. And we actually see television shows dedicated today to these kinds of creative exercises in cooking. One of my favorites is with baking cupcakes. And then human conceptions of the goods and ends of life are extended. And so here we might think about what the place of meat is in human life and where it might fit into cooking, or whether we need to exclude meat, or if we do include meat in our cooking, whether we buy organic meat, whether we go to the farmer, him or herself, to buy our meat. So there's all kinds of things that are wrapped into cooking and food that make this practice help us to understand our lives and our ends better. I want to focus for a second on the concept of internal goods. Now, internal goods contrast with external goods. So let me just talk about external goods first. External goods are goods. MacIntyre doesn't deny this. So when he talks about external goods often being put above internal goods, that's a criticism, but he's still saying that external goods are, in fact, things that we desire and could and should have. Such external goods might be money, fame, victory, and health. So when we talk about, say, baseball or chess, victory might be something that we're aiming at, but it's always an external good. And the reason that it's an external good is because it's not central to the practice of chess or baseball. You can still play baseball and gain all of the benefits from baseball, even if you don't keep score or if you lose. So a question that you might ask if you're trying to figure out what the internal goods of your practice are is to ask, can I get it from more than one practice or from some other activity? Can I get money from some other activity? Obviously, the answer is yes. Therefore, it is not an internal good. So internal goods then are concrete and specific. They can only derive from this or that practice. Right? And I'll give you an example in a second. And there are also things that give our practice and our life meaning. So let's think about agility for a second. We might talk about agility as an internal good of our practice. But agility is not concrete and specific enough because we can get agility per se from dancing or from gymnastics. But we understand that agility is an internal good of dance if we contextualize it, make it concrete and specific. So the agility that a dancer has is different from the agility that a gymnast has. And so we would say the agility that comes from dancing, that would be the internal good. Or the agility that comes from gymnastics, and that would be the internal good there. If we go back to the example of cooking, we might talk about the internal good of the health of a meal that results through the application of heat. We know, for example, that heating certain vegetables releases more of their vitamins than eating them raw. And so that would be an internal good of cooking. To move on then, we can think about virtues in relation to these practices. And for an initial definition, we can think about virtues as habits or dispositions which help us to achieve the internal goods of practices. So all practices involve justice, courage, and honesty. Justice, of course, I don't want to poison anyone with my cooking. Courage, I might want to try different spices together or make something new that I've never made before. And honesty from people and for myself about whether the food actually tastes good. Practices then are the first level of virtues and goods, but we can also talk about a second level. And here we want to talk about the narrative unity of life. We understand ourselves in all of our actions, whether it's teaching philosophy and cooking dinner and playing Dungeons and Dragons, as making a sort of consistent whole for ourselves. And so MacIntyre is really pushing against the fragmentation of modern life, that we go to church on Sunday and learn about giving to the poor, and yet on Monday we go to work and we fire 10 people or 100 people or 1,000 people. And so what MacIntyre is trying to do here with this concept is say that when we want to figure out what's really good for us, we have to put that into the context of how they fit into the larger scheme of my life. And so the narrative unity of a life we might think of as a quest, and every quest has a telos. Now, of course, when we're on a quest, like any good quest from the medieval ages, we recognize that the quest itself involves a discovery in which we might figure out what actually it is that we're after. We might go into the quest thinking that we're going to do one thing and come outside the quest realizing that the good that we're desiring is something else completely. So many people, when they start college, think that they're going to college to receive a particular kind of good. Maybe they go into psychology because they want to help people understand their lives better and they want to become a therapist. And then they come out the other side of college and they realize that what their real passion is for is a research into how animals react to human beings and how we might make animals happier. The narrative unity of life, of course, is a quest in which we might encounter harms, dangers, distractions, and temptations. And what the virtues do here is help us to overcome these harms, dangers, distractions, and temptations. Anyone who has been through graduate school knows that there's a danger in not finishing and being distracted by other things. There's always temptations to read other books that we shouldn't be reading. And so the virtues of patience and courage help us to stay focused so that we can complete our plan. I want to go quickly through the third aspect of goods and virtues, and that's the tradition. Now, MacIntyre defines a tradition as an ongoing historical and socially contextualized argument about the goods. And modernity is typically rejecting tradition, but they don't think of tradition as seeking goods. They think of traditions as something that we're stuck in. MacIntyre wants to completely change that. Traditions are something that we're part of, and we're engaged in a debate over what the good of life is. And so that debate might include a larger community. So we tell our story in the context of this community, this history, this tradition. And without that community and history and tradition, our story really doesn't make sense. The virtues here then help us to sustain the communal relationships necessary for the tradition, realizing the internal goods, and sustaining our individual lives. And so just to kind of end here, Virtues tie back then to human flourishing, and what we're looking for is this telos